everybody. You can respond. Good evening. Thank you. So my name is Dr. Nicole Truesdell, and I'm the Senior Director of Academic Diversity and Inclusiveness and a Professor of Anthropology here at Beloit College. I first want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I especially want to thank our Beloit community members, because this work demands collaboration between the college and our community across the city. So from Black Lives Matter's Beloit, we want to extend a thank you for you all to come and acknowledge that. So tonight we're focusing on whiteness. In particular, we're focusing on the construction and perpetuation of whiteness through a couple of different lenses: racism, activism, and politics, as it relates to the larger inception and creation of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a conversation like we've had before last semester with our Black Lives Matter panels, so this will be an interactive one. So I'll direct you that we'll have 2 mics down here, one in the middle, and one on the side, and we have 2 roaming mics. Can both my colleagues raise their hand? Amunga Mantina and Gabriela Okinawa-Akel. We'll have 2 mics up top. And so what we'll do is throughout the conversation, I'll be looking to the audience as a constant engagement with you guys. Okay? So everyone know the ground rules. All right, so let's welcome to the stage our 2 guests. I'd like to welcome anti-racist activist, lecturer, and essayist Tim Wise, and Associate Professor of Anthropology and Critical Identity Studies, and the Beloit Junior Professor of International Studies, Dr. Lisa Anderson-Levy. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's lay the groundwork. Since Trayvon Martin, the U.S. as a nation and its citizens have been forced to re-engage with issues of racism, race, police violence, the military state, class, and privilege. This has not been a smooth, comfortable, or even coherent engagement of all these issues. But what has emerged since Trayvon's murder is a national movement. That movement, started by 3 Black, 2 who are queer women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, is Black Lives Matter. So because of that, the nation is being forced to talk about Black lives actually mattering. But some would argue that it is not possible to move a discussion about racism or activism around racism or anti-Black racism without engaging head-on the idea of whiteness. So let's open it up. Lisa, what do you think about that?
Well, before I respond, let me make a short public service announcement, which is I have really bad allergies this time of year, so if I'm coughing, just know that I'm fine and I'm not contagious, so everybody's fine. So the role of whiteness in thinking about Black Lives Matter. See, part of what I think is important when we think about whiteness is to recognize that whiteness and Blackness come into view with each other. Or if you want to think about whiteness and non-whiteness as coming into view with each other. In other words, one can't exist without the other. So if we're talking about a political movement around anti-Black racism, it becomes really crucial to think about the role of whiteness. It isn't the case that Blackness or any other non-whiteness exists in some kind of vacuum by itself, right? Black folks didn't become Black folks on their own. That happened with what? European intervention, right? So, and sort of as Europeans moved across the globe. So I think it's important to sort of keep some of those histories in mind. The other thing I want to say quickly is we also need to pay attention to the terms we use. So when I tell people I study whiteness, the first thing they think is I study the KKK, because it's uncomfortable maybe for people to think about whiteness as an analytic category that you can study, right? So that it has political, economic, and social components, which it does. And so as we think about what whiteness is, it's important to recognize that it's not just the skin color, it's not just about the body, right? Because many of you already know and think about race as socially constructed, right? That means we made it up. The rules about what it is, we made up. And that the rules about what it is changes through time. So what we think about as white today isn't what it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, right? So when we use terms like Caucasian, this is kind of a pseudo-scientific term. And in our use, we perpetuate the thing that we're trying to fight against, right? So if, for example, you're sort of tied to using the word Caucasian, I hope after tonight you won't. Caucasian is just as valid a term as Mongoloid or Negroid. And so if you're unwilling to use any of the two I just mentioned, Caucasian should move away from your vocabulary, right? Because in its use, it's kind of like people of color. I have problems with that term too, and we use it all the time. But in using the term people of color, what are we saying? White is not a color. Do you see that? Now, I'm not providing a lot of answers for us today, but I want you to think about some of this. Okay, sorry, I talked a lot. Go ahead.
I can listen to you all night. I'm really good with that, actually. Well, thank you, first of all, for everyone who made this possible for us to be up on the stage together and, you know, bring me back to Beloit. I was here, I guess, about 18 months ago, so it's good to be back and to see many of you again. In relation to your question, I think that it is impossible to really understand the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for black and brown liberation more generally, if we don't interrogate whiteness, because the only reason that one has to proclaim that Black Lives Matter is because whiteness says that they don't. And whiteness has always said that those lives don't matter, and it is the ubiquity of whiteness, the dominance of the white racial frame, or as Joe Fagan calls it, the white racial gaze, that requires the proclamation of that, which apparently is not obvious. Now, it ought to be obvious, and some people push back against the term by saying, well, all lives matter, which is sort of like, you know, if you imagine 1985, when the HIV/AIDS crisis was sort of becoming really a prominent issue in this country, and groups like ACT UP were out in the streets, and others, Gay Men's Health Crisis, out in the streets, demanding that people with AIDS lives mattered, would sort of be like running into the middle of one of those events and saying, but people die of pancreatic cancer too. Yes, sweetheart, we know, right? There are other issues. Yes, other people's lives also matter. Yes, it's true that you could, I guess, run into a child cancer ward and talk about sudden infant death syndrome, but you'd be a real asshole if you did that, right? Like at some point, you have to proclaim that which is being ignored precisely because it is. And whiteness has always said that black and brown lives, indigenous lives, lives of color, lives that were quote unquote non-white, were either worthless or worth less than those that were white. And so if we're going to really understand the struggle of BLM, and we're going to understand the larger struggle against police misconduct, against housing discrimination, educational discrimination, wealth inequality, we're going to have to engage the way that whiteness has allowed us to have this default position that we've all internalized that says that it's okay, apparently, for African American folks to be twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed even when they have a college degree. Because apparently we think that's okay. Because if we didn't think it was okay, we would do something about that. But we haven't, so we must think it's okay. Or that it's okay for black children to be 3.5 times more likely than white children to be poor. We must think that that's okay. Because if we didn't think it was okay, we'd do something about it. Or for black folks to have 1/15 the net worth of white folks. We must think that that is okay. Because if we didn't, we would have done something about it. Or for young black men to be 21 times more likely than young white men to be killed by police, 2 to 3 times more likely when unarmed. We must think that that is okay. Who says it's okay? I don't say it's okay. The people on this stage and most of you in the room don't, but whiteness says it is okay. Whiteness as a paradigm of thought and behavior apparently doesn't have a problem with that. And so until we deconstruct whiteness, and I would argue eradicate the paradigm of whiteness. That is not, by the way, the same as saying eradicating white people. So before someone tweets out that I just advocated genocide, let me be very clear, and it goes to your point. Whiteness and white people are not the same thing. There's no such thing as white people, but there is a thing called whiteness. White people do not exist as such except for the last 400 years. It's a term that we created as a con job to take poor Europeans and make them think that they had something in common with rich people, right? And we're still playing that game, which is why a rich white man can tell poor white people that their problem is poor brown people, and they will believe it, and they will vote for him for president of the United States. So we're still dealing with that irrationality because we haven't been able to divide whiteness from white people. The problem, as James Baldwin said about white people, is that they think you're white. And as long as you think you're white, as Baldwin said, there is no hope for you, right? So until you begin to realize that you're not white, you were made white for the sake of elites that don't like you, don't want anything to do with you, ain't gonna make you a member of the club, they're just teasing you, right? Unless you come to understand that, we'll continue to play these games and fight amongst each other over the pieces of a pie that not one of y'all own. I don't own it, and you don't know anybody that owns it, but they got you fighting over the pieces of a pie that you don't even have access to. Crumbs falling off the table of a pie that you don't have access to. That's what whiteness is. Everybody would be better off to eradicate that, including those people called white. We'd be better off to eradicate that. That's not healthy for anybody's children. So that's why we need to talk about that subject when we talk about, issues of black and brown liberation.
And see, the thing that Tim just referred to, this investment in whiteness, is part of the problem, right? So it isn't just the case that sort of back in the day, white people had some privileges, but now everything's even, right? Because what we're talking about is sort of investment in a particular identity that has benefited you over time. And so that continued investment is what we need to dissuade people from. Continuing to invest in this sort of ubiquitous, harmful, I don't know how to frame it, poisonous identity is part of what is problematic with sort of getting to whiteness, right? So I thought of something else I know. Sorry, I do this all the time in classes. It's really annoying. So as part of what is important as we talk about and think about whiteness is the recognition that, how can I say this? Or the understanding that when we, I'm losing my train of thought, when we are engaging about whiteness, part of what we're doing is we're saying, I totally forgot where I was going.
Well, let's talk about this though. This idea of investment in whiteness, right? Because the common counter narrative, right, or the counter thing is to say, well, if you really just work hard, right? So this is in the past, but since we've had the civil rights movement, right? We've got laws that have changed. So really, it's just about somebody working hard, having autonomy, right? This individuality. If you did that, then we can get away from all this. How do you respond to that when that becomes the most basic and the most common counter narrative to exactly what both of y'all are trying to talk about?
I remembered what I was going to say about whiteness.
Get it, just get it. Go ahead and do it.
And it's kind of a little thing, but I feel that it's important. That when we talk about this thing, we need to recognize that it's not the case that whiteness exists, first of all, across the United States or across the world as one thing. This is a very kind of complicated category, and I think one of the disservice that talking about whiteness does is it makes it seem as though this is a coherent and unified category. And when we talk about it, we need to always understand that it is not that, right? It operates in different ways according to the other ways that people are situated. So one example is if I'm a white woman who is queer, my identity and the way that I operate and live in whiteness is going to be different than a white straight man or whoever else. So I think it's really important to pay attention to all the ways that whiteness changes in its operation or is affected in its operation by the other parts of our identities. Because then what happens when we fail to do that is we begin to, make assumptions about people and make claims about what is happening. So when we say whiteness this evening, right, we're sort of clumping some of those together to make the explanations easier, but you should always recognize that they're more complex than that the category is more complex than we're dealing with right now.
Well, and this sort of gets to your question also, because I think that the point you're making, which is that whiteness is mediated by these other identities, speaks to that issue of, rugged individualism and how we live as individuals making our way in the world with this notion, that if we just work hard, everything will be fine, and we all have these struggles, and so a person who is white but is also a woman, or white but working class, or white but LGBT, or white but disabled, right, would be able to maybe argue, well, I've faced struggle, and they would not be lying in that. I mean, that would be very accurate. But the fact that your identity is mediated as a white person by other things doesn't mean that there isn't white privilege or advantage that attaches. It may be different than mine. Like, I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight, I'm cisgendered, I'm able-bodied. So I've got a lot of those privileged identities. Now, I'm Jewish, grew up in Nashville, so there's that. It's a little complicated. But for the most part, like, all my identities are pretty dominant. And that's definitely different than someone who grew up. Of course, you talk about white privilege with most white folks and they get defensive and all of a sudden they're all from Appalachia. You ever notice that? Like, well, I grew up in a coal mining town. No, you didn't. Like, most of the people who say that are lying. It's like when people say they have black friends, they're usually lying. Same thing when they say that they're from Appalachia. But no doubt white folks have struggled. I mean, I grew up in an 850 square foot apartment from the day that I was 3 days old, came back from the hospital, to the day I walked out the door to go to college. We didn't have any money. If this government had a more honest definition of the poverty line, my family would have been considered poor. But I still had advantage in the way that I was treated in school. Still had advantage in the presumptions of my competence. Like, I had to work really hard to prove what a bad student I was. Like, I was a really crappy student. Like, until about, 4 o'clock today, I was a really bad student. And then I got it together like a couple hours ago. We were talking, I'm like, I'm good now, But I had to work to prove that I didn't know what I was talking about because I was presumed to be competent. That's privilege in spite of lack of money. I was treated differently by cops, who would roll up on our house parties in high school, kids drinking underage, smoking weed. The cops knew it, and they would tell us to turn down our music. And then they'd roll out, and nobody went to jail, and that's privilege. So it isn't that individual initiative doesn't matter. It isn't that those things don't get in the way sometimes, and folks struggle, and we all have struggles. I'm the child of an alcoholic and an addict, and so I've faced a lot of dysfunction. But there was still that thing, and I think sometimes we think that the mediation of the identity somehow negates the reality of the privilege, but that would be absurd, right? You think about, like, people with disabilities. There are people with disabilities who are rich, right? There are people with disabilities got money in the bank, maybe more money than you and I got in the bank. That doesn't change the fact that, generally speaking, being able-bodied sort of gives you an advantage, right? There are rich people who are miserable human beings, who have horrible relationships with their kids, who might be unhealthy, even if they can pay for health care. They might have, they might have cancer, they might have horrible health issues. That doesn't change the fact that, generally speaking, having money gives you an advantage, right? It doesn't take away. I mean, sometimes exceptions to the rule prove the rule. right? It's like we know smoking really does cause cancer. That's not just some scare theory, that's real. And yet you may have an Aunt Polly who has smoked for 70 years and doesn't even cough. That doesn't disprove the relationship between smoking and cancer. Good for Polly, but it means nothing in a social science sense. It's like you can get shot in the head and not die, but guess what, Cupcake? If you get shot in the head, you're pretty likely to die. There's a really high correlation. So I'm just saying, sometimes it's about thinking these things through as social phenomena. And instead, what we do is we get caught up in the discussion about this being about individuals. So it's like, well, I'm not a racist, right? We're not talking about individual bad people, good people when we talk about racism. And when we talk about privilege, we're not talking about rich people and everybody else. We're talking about the day-to-day relative advantages of having one identity versus another. And that's real. And the analogy I use is like, to me, white folks were sort of like snowflakes, right? Here's what I mean by that. Like, all snowflakes are different, that's what they tell us. I don't know how they know that, by the way, but apparently they do. Apparently they've looked at every snowflake and we know they're all different. But here's the thing, even if we assume that all snowflakes are different, we know a snowflake when we see a snowflake, do we not? And in the seeing of the snowflake, we can generally make some assumptions about its life trajectory and not be too far from the mark. Like, we're gonna maybe be a little off, like how did it drift and what exactly did it crystallize? But generally, I see the snowflake, I know a little something about its life, I make an assumption, and I'm not gonna be totally right because that snowflake might have had a working class background, I don't know. But generally speaking, I will know that it's a snowflake, I can make an assumption, and I'll probably be pretty close in terms of what it means. Right?
So one of the other things with that question is about the accumulation of wealth over time. So this is one of the places that a lot of white people get stuck in thinking about how it is that whiteness confers benefit, right? So there's been a fair amount that has been written about how it is that over time, through US history, whiteness became conflated with freedom, right? And blackness became sort of paradigmatic of the enslaved condition. And then as we move through time, then because whiteness was conflated with freedom, it meant that people in particular bodies, white bodies, had opportunities to buy stuff, to own things, including other people, in the way that black people did not, right? And over time, that adds up. So if Tim sort of talked a little bit about his history, but if you can imagine someone, I can't even think of a good example, buying a house, some house that you bought in 1950 or 40 or 30, let's go back, 30. And that house was worth $3,000 when you bought it, right? In a neighborhood that the US government made sure that people of color could not also purchase in. And there were a lot of policies about this. Many people don't know that this is part of our history, or many white people don't know that this is part of our history. And so you buy this house for $3,000, and over time, so like you buy that in 1930 and it goes through generations, and so today that house is worth $1.5 million, right? Let's suppose it's in New York someplace. And then think of the accumulation of wealth over all that time. Now, the same, or if we think of a black family, right, who was not allowed to buy in that same neighborhood. The neighborhood that that family was allowed to buy in is a less desirable neighborhood. The house still costs the same, or we could even imagine that the house costs more, $5,000 in 1940 now. So it costs $5,000 in a less desirable neighborhood, and now today, it's not even there because the neighborhood got destroyed to put a freeway through there. There's no accumulation of wealth over time, and nothing for people to inherit over time, right? So no sort of borrowing against the house to go to college, no using the equity from the house to do anything. And all of that goes through time.
Right.
So when people say stuff like, well, my family worked really hard too, of course they did. They all did. But the benefits of the work are different depending on how you are positioned by race. It is not always the case that because people of color have less assets or have less money or whatever, that they work less, although that's the narrative we tell ourselves, because to tell ourselves anything different is to say the whole system is unfair. And that's no good. We don't want to do that.
Right.
Because then it would mean that if I'm white, I'm unfairly advantaged. And what does that mean, right? Unfairly advantaged. If I'm white, it might mean that I'm not as good as I thought, I'm not working as hard as I thought, that things are happening, right? And it's not only because of my effort. And that's really tough to wrap your brain around. If you've always been taught you can do whatever you do and everything you accomplish is due to your effort.
And yet what's fascinating about that mentality that it's all about me and my effort is itself part and parcel of a privileged mindset, because people from marginalized groups have always known it was a collective effort just to keep them alive, let alone to actually thrive. So for people of color, for poor white folks for that matter, who are still poor, they know that the idea that it's all about them and their individual initiative, that's something you only have the luxury of believing if you've had a certain degree of privilege and advantage where you've actually seen that work. If you haven't seen that work, you know that that's not real. And the example that you brought up about accumulated wealth, this is actually my family's story. My grandfather bought a house in 1950, the first house that my mom lived in that was an owned home as opposed to rented. Bought it in 1950. He'd been in the military, and then he was a civil servant in Corps of Engineers. So this was not a get-rich kind of job. It was a government job, but it was paid okay, had good benefits, and it was a kind of job that people of color at that time really couldn't have gotten within civil service. He buys this house in 1950, pays off the note in 15 years, buys another house with cash, pays off that note in several years, buys another house with cash, pays that note off in several years, buys another house with cash, dies in 1980. I go to college in 1986 because my grandmother is able to take her house and use that as collateral against the loan I needed to get to pay my tuition bill, because we didn't have any money. I told you, we lived in an apartment. We didn't have any dough. We didn't have any collateral, but we had that house, which was a house that was the fifth house they'd owned, paid for with cash, all tracing back to the first house, which they could only buy because they were white. They couldn't have bought that house in that neighborhood otherwise. So I'm literally going to college, 36 years after the fact on the basis of that. And right now, just to put this in some perspective, nationally, the 400 richest white people in this country have the same net worth, $2.3 trillion, the same net worth as all 40 million African Americans combined. Let me repeat. 400 white people have the same collective net worth as all black folks in the United States combined. Now, there are only two ways that you can interpret that. Number one, there are 400 white people who were just that damn smart and worked that much harder than 40 million black people combined. And if you believe that, can't do nothing for you. Like, if you're a student, disenroll. You're wasting time and money. You're wasting either your parents' money or my money as a taxpayer paying for your education. Just quit, just drop out, do something else. Like, you cannot be saved. Or the other possible interpretation is something else is going on, and it's this thing to which you're speaking, which is that some folks had advantages and opportunities that other folks didn't have. And some of that was about race, some of that was about economic advantage, some of that was about being men, some of it was all three of those things, whatever. But it had nothing to do with merit. And the quicker we get used to being able to tell our own story, like, I'm not ashamed about the fact that I went to college on that house. I just think that everybody should have had the opportunity to do that. I'm not beating myself up about it. It wasn't my fault. I was born into that, but I need to own that. Because if I can't own that and I start thinking that it's all about me, and then my children come to think, I got a 14 and a 12-year-old, and they start thinking, well, we've worked really hard. You're 14. You hadn't done a damn thing. You hadn't done anything. You graduated lower school. You're about to graduate middle school. Congratulations. That was hard. It's like, at best, I worked hard, and hell, I didn't even really work hard. I got stuff handed to me. So let's just own our stuff. And then we can have an honest conversation about how to create opportunity for everybody, you know?
Okay. I saw a hand in the audience. Come to the mic, Professor Majid, please. There we go.
Thank you very much. Can we bring the conversation closer to home and say what?
Can you bring the mic down too? Thank you.
Can we bring the conversation closer to home and consider what we can do at Beloit College better to interrogate whiteness on this campus, and what do we lose if we do not?
Take it away.
Okay, so there are a lot of ways to think about that question. So the first place that I'm going to go is so let me back up a little bit. One of the places that I think that people get stuck, right? So when white people go to Black Lives Matter, other kinds of activist spaces, they get all kind of fired up and they get excited, and then they go to the what can I do place. Tell me what to do. So that is the number one question you shouldn't ask. And let me explain why. In the question that says, tell me how I can help, if you are white and you ask that question, what that means is that you understand yourself as outside of a raced position, right? So race belongs to people who are not white, and they're the ones with the issue, and you're over here going, I'm a really good person, tell me how I can help you. That's a less useful question to ask. So what you should be doing is saying, let me look at how my whiteness matters, not just in some kind of intellectual or academic way, but how does my whiteness matter in every encounter I have? How does my whiteness matter on this campus, if I'm to answer Professor Majid's question, when I'm in the classroom, when I construct my syllabi? Who's on my syllabi? Who are the knowledge producers or the scholars who are included on my syllabi? How does it matter in advising relationships with people? How does it matter when I go to the grocery store? See, one of the things that I think we miss in understanding activist work as, and we were talking about this earlier, as kind of a 9-to-5 job, right? So I put on my activist hat and I go someplace else, whether you go to Ferguson or you go to wherever's, Milwaukee, to do activist work, and then you come home and you sit with your friends who all look like you, right? You drink with people who all look like you, and then you feel like you've done something. Not really. Not really. If you're not interrogating your whiteness all the time, every day, you're not actually engaging. So if I were to answer that question, the thing that I would say is, what would it mean for all of the faculty here to begin to interrogate their whiteness in a way that enriches their scholarship? What might that look like? What might it look like if we ask students to interrogate their own? So teachers are really good about asking students to do stuff, but we are not so good about trying to do it ourselves, right? And I think that that's really important. If I'm asking students to come into my classroom and be vulnerable enough to learn some difficult stuff about whiteness, well, you know what? I think I should be about anything. I think I should be willing to make myself uncomfortable too, and we are not as good about that. So that's how I would begin to answer that question, Professor Majid.
And I would agree with all that and only add that I think if you want a campus to interrogate its norm, which at a historically white college. I know we don't have an acronym for that like we do for HBCUs, but
Oh, we do, PWI,
yeah.
primarily white institution.
Yeah, I think we should just call it.
We can do
yeah,
it.
I know.
We can make
do,
them
but
up.
We don't use it. It's not known, right? Historically white colleges, HWCUs, PWIs, whatever we. If we're going to interrogate the norm, you have to operationalize that at an institutional and systemic level, and not just sort of encourage it and hope that people will run with it. So I mean, it really becomes a matter of the administration of such an institution saying the following, saying that to be qualified to teach at this school, to be qualified to be a staff member at this school, is to either already have done some of this work in your history before you come here, or be ready to do so and prepared to acknowledge the importance of that as part of being considered credentialed. See, because right now we hire folks on the basis of how many publications they got, how many conferences they presented at, what their student evals look like, which are usually, if you talk about race and gender issues, gonna suck when it comes to a bunch of white dudes giving you evals at the end of the year who don't want to deal with race and don't want to deal with gender. I mean, literally, I run into professors that teach like African American women's literature, and at the end of the year, the student evals are like, why did we only study black women authors? Well, damn, fool, it was an African American women's lit class. Why are you even, but this is the thing. And then people lose tenure over that. People don't get tenure because of the evals that people who don't want to deal with real subject matter give them. So we need to actually change the criteria for what it means to be qualified to be a scholar. And if you still teach Shakespeare the way people taught it in 1959, for instance, and you don't know about feminist critiques of Shakespeare, and you don't know about multicultural radical critiques of Shakespeare, you're not a Shakespeare scholar anymore. You're a Shakespeare scholar if we put you in a time machine and zap you back to 1959, but right now you're not competent any longer. If you teach art history and don't have those critiques, you're not competent any longer. If you teach political science and you haven't been influenced by feminist critiques and radical multicultural critiques, you are not competent anymore. I don't give a damn if you got 30 books presented at 100,000 conferences and got great student evals and recommendations. You are not qualified to teach in a 21st century classroom. And so until and unless colleges start saying that is our criteria, you will either meet it or you will find another gig, then we're not going to actually change the way whiteness operates on our campuses. It is that serious that we have to be willing to actually force the issue. And then if scholars don't want to do that, well, I don't want to interrogate whiteness. Good, there are other places to teach. See ya, Good luck, God bless, find a job. But you're not going to work here because we're serious about interrogating these issues and we're serious about creating equity. And until we do that, we're going to keep getting the same results, I think, over and over again.
So let's follow up on that real quick before we go back to the audience. And kind of going off Professor Majid's comment, but taking it to a national level. So we're in the middle of a political presidential campaign that's been going on for God knows how long and continue to go until next year. But a particular incident happened that I want to highlight as a way to kind of get at some of these issues you're talking about at more of a national level to bring it back down home. So during a Bernie Sanders speech, he was heckled by a couple of Black Lives Matter activists who happened to be women. Bernie literally dropped the mic and walked off the stage. And white liberals across the country, and some black and brown liberals as well, invoked the level of respectability politics, right, that condemned their actions. Said they shouldn't have done it there because of Bernie's history in the civil rights movement that he gets it. So then what is it about white progressive politics and liberals that closes the door to any serious conversations about race? I went there.
Oh boy, where to start with this one? This one's going to take a while to answer. So, okay. One way to think about this is, so earlier I gave the example of the, what can I do, why that's a problematic stance. Many white liberals, and I think that part of what makes this difficult for me to talk about and for white liberals to talk about is that we have a sort of ethos in the US that says if you try really hard and your intentions are good, then you should get the star. You should get the gold star. And this work, I think, actually doesn't operate like that. Because you can have the very best intentions and they actually don't matter if the effect they're having, the effect of your behavior or your actions is harmful. So I think that this is sort of a legacy, a post-civil rights legacy, which says that we need to distinguish between the good white people and the bad white people, right? The good white people being what I call the progressive white liberals, and the bad white people are the people with the crosses. Now, this understanding affects how we think about who is racist and what racist behavior is. So we can all agree, I hope, that when someone burns a cross on my yard, that's a racist act. Perhaps we can all agree that when someone follows me through the high-end jewelry store, that's probably racist too. Where we might disagree is it racist if you're teaching American literature and everybody on your syllabus is white? Do you see what I mean? That there are ways of thinking about what this thing is, and oftentimes the tension is between goodness, right, which people want to do good and their good intentions, and then what the effect is over here. So to answer the question about what is it about white liberalness that's problematic, the way that I think about it is part of what is problematic is that white liberals understand themselves as not having to engage with race because they already got it. Their parents were civil rights activists, or their grandparents, depending on what the age was, or maybe they were, right? They marched, they protested, they did the work, and feel like now, okay, I'm done, I got this. Except for the thing that they marched about in 1960 is different than the thing that we're talking about now, right? I'm not saying, the thing I'm saying is that the texture of the thing is different, the thing. The texture of racism is different now. And so when white liberals understand themselves as not having, as already good people, right, who have already done the work or thought about it, to engage now in a way that says, actually, you are part of a system that is racist. You are part of a system that damages other human beings every day, whether you choose to recognize that or not. Who wants to hear that? Who wants to engage with that, right? It tilts your world a little bit. And I think that that's part of why white liberals don't want to engage. I think it's about fear of understanding themselves as bad people. I think it's about fear of getting to the place where they can talk about their own complicity. That part really sucks. Nobody wants to talk about complicity, right? Nobody wants to say, you know what? I actually benefit from the way things are. People want to act like that's some kind of accident. It's coincidence, but it really is not.
And it's harder for that person who's liberal, ostensibly progressive, compassionate and concerned about the other, quote unquote. It's harder for them to look at the ugliness of the reality than it would be for someone who maybe wasn't so committed. right? Because it's precisely your goodness, precisely your commitment to be doing the right thing that makes it so difficult to look in the mirror and realize you might be doing the wrong thing. So I think your point is well taken. The other point I'd make about that, though, and I think about this based a lot on my background as being a Southerner, because I think that there's a geographic issue that's involved here, too. Here's the thing. If you're a white leftist from the South, as I am, you absolutely know that race is the center of everything that happens in this country. You cannot have come to your leftist politics as a Southerner and not understand the centrality of race. Because if you're going to be a leftist in the South at all, which is not, not common politically, but those of us who are came through a racial lens. No exceptions, none. But white folks outside the South who came to their liberalism or their progressivism or their leftism, a lot of times they didn't have to confront race the same way, because that's why when it comes to Bernie Sanders, this is a guy, he's from Brooklyn, but he's been in Vermont for a really long time, right? And no offense, like Vermont's a lovely state, but it's really white. It's really white, right? And so he and a lot of, he didn't have to engage race every day as the mayor of Burlington or as a senator from Vermont. He doesn't have to engage race the same way he was even in the 60s, right? And a lot of his supporters come from that. So they came to their leftism through the environmental movement, through the anti-war movement, through the third wave feminism or the women's movement, through the LGBT liberation movement, all of which are important, by the way. I'm not trying to in any way demean those relative to the anti-racism movement. I'm just saying, if you come to your leftism outside the South, you might never have really had to engage race as central, because if y'all from the North, you think that just because you were on the right side of the Civil War, you don't have a problem, see? You think that it's my people that have a problem, because we were on the wrong side, and I'm clear about that, by the way, so, thank you for your help. However, right, Malcolm X said everything south of Canada was the South, so let's remember that as well. And let's be clear that in a way, I think the reason, I was interviewed recently about Madison, and progressive cities like Madison. Progressive cities very much in quote marks, right? And I made the point, I got a lot of flack for it from nice white liberals, but it's not even contestable that Madison, Wisconsin is the most institutionally racist city in this state. That isn't, you may find that hard to believe, but the data is clear, because when I say institutionally racist, I'm referring to the disparities that exist between white over here and black and brown over here, and they are worse in Dane County than any other county in the state. So whether we're talking about incarceration disparities, arrest rates, housing foreclosures, wealth disparities, health disparities, educational disparities, the gaps are bigger there. Now, white folks who are progressive think that is some kind of heaven. Just like they think Portland is heaven, and Seattle is heaven, and the Bay Area is heaven. And I have black and brown friends that'll tell you the Bay Area of San Francisco and Oakland is the most racist place they've ever lived. And white folks are like, what? That's where the Grateful Dead is from. That's how is that possible? That's like, I love that area, whatever. But institutionally, those disparities are worse there. And the difference is that white leftists in those areas, some, not all, didn't have to come up thinking about race, so they don't see race. They don't see that racism because they got their hot yoga joint, and they got their Pilates studio, and they got their little hipster coffee joint, and they, had an anti-war march with a bunch of people. And so that is what, in their mind, I guess, makes a place progressive. But for people of color who are dealing with race every day, those places can be very stifling. So I think part of it is this thing that, that's why I bet it's like, I did a speech out in LA many years ago where this very well-intended white woman came up to me and she said, I think it's so great that you do what you do, being from the South and everything. And I was like, and it was funny because a buddy of mine who I've been friends with, best friends since we're 5, and he teaches out in LA now at Cal State. And he was standing right there. And I look at him, she says this thing about the South, and he looks at me and we just smiled. And I looked at her and I said, yeah, I don't really trust any white people that aren't from the South. And she looked wounded. She looked seriously, she was like, what? I thought she was gonna cry. And I sort of said it just to get her upset like that. I was sort of in that frame in that moment, like, I'm gonna really hurt you right now. I was actually sort of trying to upset her a little bit, but it also was sort of true. Because I actually do think that white folks from the South, if you grew up in the South and you still ended up on the left, I think you understand race a lot better than a lot of white folks in other parts of the country that maybe didn't have to deal with that. And I think that's another piece of it that, you know, we want to think about when we think about what it means to be white and progressive. You know, it's very different. White progressive from Montgomery, Alabama is going to have a very, I think, keener understanding of race and racism than a white progressive from Spokane, Washington, you know? Yeah.
Well, and I think too that, and this is connected to what we were saying earlier, which is it's really easy to join a movement. It's really easy to sign a petition online. It's really easy to say, you know, when you're sitting around drinking with your friends, that, you know, what ought to happen and what kind of difference you want to make in the world. And it's work, right? So there are days that I don't feel like walking around in my skin, right? Because it's a pain in the butt. There are days that I can't be bothered with what it's gonna entail. I'm tired already before I get out of bed, right? And so the work, the reflective work that needs to happen with white progressives is for them to think about their whiteness like that all the time. So in the way that I would be at a grocery store or whatever, and the clerk is rude, so I'm thinking in my head, okay, so is this about gender? Is this about race? Or is this about she's hungry and I'm just the last person she wants to talk to, right? So this is what white people need to begin to do. So when you go to Starbucks and everybody is happy and pleasant to you, that's the place you need to go, oh, is this happening because I'm white? Or is this happening because she just got a raise? Do you see what I mean? It needs to be that race becomes a lens that you don't take off. Because you actually don't take it off. You just have been fooled. The trickery of whiteness is that you've been fooled into thinking that you don't have it. But it's there. But you just need to act like it's there.
So we have about a half hour left, and I want to be able to engage the audience some more. Anyone have a question or comment? Really? Upstairs, up top.
So my question kind of relates to addressing problems, so we kind of expanded out, and I want to bring it back in for a second. I'm kind of thinking about how polarizing these conversations are. And there's been a lot of head nodding, and it's great. We're all coming to some sort of growth process. The issue that I have that I'm hoping that you could touch on a little bit is how do we bring these issues to places where it's maybe not as welcome? I'm wondering if there are any approaches to have civil dialogue that have worked more for you in the past. And I know that's very ambiguous. There are a lot of different examples. And maybe even there are times where civil discourse or civil dialogue isn't, because you mentioned, like, you can go ahead and just, the teachers, you might as well, we don't need you. But if it's a social group, they can just go back to their friends, they can go back to Facebook, and kind of hide behind the solace of their friends. Is there a way to kind of address that? And then, yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Of course there are ways to address it. So first, I think we need to dispense with the idea that conversations about race or anything always need to be civil. Now, I'm not advocating that, whatever, we're running around with machetes. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is it's okay to engage in difficulty. It's okay to make folks uncomfortable, and it's okay to say the thing that is not going to make people go, that's going to make people go like this. I think, right? It's fine. So then I guess the other thing that I would say is, and it's funny, that's a really good question, because when I talk about race in classes, I often find myself, and I talked about this with a class I had a couple of years ago, I often find myself sort of mediating whiteness for white students, right? So I'm in a classroom where I'm the authority figure, and I'm talking about whiteness, and I'm trying to talk about it in a way that won't make the white students mad. That is some serious stuff when you think about what's happening in my head and the place that I live in, right? So I think you ought not worry so much about making people mad. I think you ought to talk about it in a way that meets people where they are, because, you know, talking about white privilege on this college campus is very different than going out to Walmart or Woodman's and talking about it, where people don't engage with it all the time. So you have to change how what your expectations of your audience are, and you just have to do it. You can't worry about upsetting people, because no matter what you do, if you are talking about race in these United States, somebody's going to get mad. Because people are invested in particular ways of understanding particular bodies and in particular relationships of power. So we haven't really said power yet, but that is all over what we're talking about when we say whiteness. It is threaded all the way through it. And so, you know, are there ways to do this better? I would say that one of the things that I think is less helpful, and, you know, college students engage in this a lot, this kind of political correct shutdown. Oh, whatever, you just said something that has totally offended me and now I can't talk to you. Right? Don't do that. Understand that people are in different places, and recognize that if you are serious about this, you are going to get bumped and bruised, and you just need to get up and keep going. That it's not going to be kumbaya all the time, and it shouldn't be.
And I would just add to your question, as far as an answer from me, that even though we don't want to erase the potentiality of drama and conflict, because these are hard issues, one way to at least minimize the way in which that can go really wrong and therefore not serve the purpose of the dialogue that we're trying to have is, I think, if you make yourself vulnerable in that conversation, you end up with less pushback and hostility. You might still have some conflict. There might still be some beef at a moderate level, but it's not going to be high-level stuff. Because, and what I mean by that is, you know, if you're wanting someone else to acknowledge their privilege, but you're not willing to go first, right? So it's more like I'm looking at you and tell me about your privilege, like I've got a hot light on you and you're being interrogated. Very few people are going to jump to that. And, oh, yes, of course, whatever you say, right? On the other hand, if you acknowledge like the reason I acknowledged that stuff earlier about my family in the house, right? Just trying to model what that looks like. I owned that. Like I didn't beat myself up about it, but I also didn't deny it, right? And part of it is saying like, hey, this is my story too. I'm not saying this is you over here and me over here and I'm the good white person and you're the bad. No, this is, and, you know, faculty of color. I mean, I've talked to plenty of faculty of color around the country who talk about this as a pedagogical tool that they use in class. They may not have white privilege. They may not have male privilege if they're a woman of color, but they're a professor. They've got a certain amount of economic and educational privilege and power vis-a-vis their students, and they can talk about that. It's not the same, but it's a form of making themselves vulnerable to say, look, we all have got some kind of unearned advantage. You know, a friend and colleague of mine, Jackie Wade, former social work professor at Middle Tennessee State and a really great educator on these issues, talks about this. An African-American woman who, when she talks to groups of color and white folks, she says, look, we all have a couple of nickels in the quarter, right? Is her way of saying it. So she says to folks of color, you got a couple nickels in the quarter. Now, some of the white folks, y'all might have a couple of dimes in the quarter, but black and brown folks have got a couple nickels. Maybe that's the male nickel. Maybe that's the straight nickel. Maybe that's the able-bodied nickel. So you can also talk about those different types of advantage as well. So when you make yourself vulnerable, other people will come to the conversation more easily. Same thing with bias. If I'm trying to get somebody to acknowledge their internalized subconscious or implicit bias, but I don't ever acknowledge that I've had those thoughts or I've had then who's going to want to go first? Nobody. So one of the ways pedagogically, strategically, right, is to put yourself in the middle of the problem that you're identifying, rather than standing outside of the problem and sort of saying, and then y'all are all going to be in the center and we're going to have a firing squad, right? So.
And see, sorry, one
Go
last
ahead,
quick
go,
thing.
keep talking.
This is part of demystifying the boogeyman racist, right? Because if you begin to understand that there is no sort of boogeyman racist, because we didn't talk about this, or not explicitly, in the sort of tension with white liberals, but this is a huge one, right? Which is no white person, no white liberal wants to be called racist. And if you engage in any kind of real way around issues of race, you might say the wrong thing. And I'm going like this around wrong, right? Because you are where you are with the information that you have. And so that right there shuts people down. The fact that you could say the wrong thing means that people just kind of go, okay, I'll just wait over here and let these people over here talk and I'll wait. Do you see what I mean? And so we need to just demystify the racist and just say, you know what? We all live and operate every day in a racist structure. None of us made it, right? None of us here today made it, but that doesn't mean it's not ubiquitous and it's not operating and we don't benefit from it in different ways. And then, you know, when we can get to that place, then that'll sort of change the conversation.
Okay. And so there's someone back here.
Hi, everyone. So the question that the person asked up there really rings true with me, I feel like, on a daily basis in terms of the information coming at us, whether it's through social media or, more importantly, I think, with individual people sharing their stories. And people share their stories in different ways with us every single day. It might be a comment about something that happened to them. It might be some inequality that they see around them. And so frequently, white people in particular, I hear them and I hear myself at times say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. And as soon as I say that, I am telling someone that I don't believe them. And we have to stop, I have to stop doing that. Like, that's what I try to work on every day. And instead of saying that, to look at someone and say, wow, I believe you. And just let what they're saying and the experience that they had and the pain and the inequality that they've gone through come out and take that in. Because when I say that, whether it's with my head or say it out loud, because I think it's more important that I say it out loud, then I'm saying, okay, I have to take some responsibility here. If I don't say that and I keep saying, and it's usually well-intended when I'm saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. You know, really, it's more like, oh, I'm surprised. Why am I surprised? Listen to what we're hearing about and what we've been hearing about, you know, all the inequity and all the pain. And I think it's one of the ways that every day that we can do that. I think the other way is to catch ourselves. So I'm going to tell a really quick story. Last weekend, it was 11 o'clock on a Friday night, and I went to bed. I just laid down, and I had a knock on the door. Nobody is knocking on my door at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. And I go to the door, and I look through the peephole, and it's a cop. And I'm kind of shocked. I'm living, in a quieter part of town, actually in the township in Beloit. And I kind of opened the door, not real sure, and he said there was a 911 call from one of these two houses. I'm in a duplex. And there was a 911 call, and it was dropped. And I said, well, I don't know, I didn't call. I checked my phone to see if I did it by accident. And he had also checked with my landlord next door. And, we talked. I actually knew who he was, but he didn't realize that till later. And I walked outside, and we talked a minute, and then he left. And I thought, he never asked to see if anybody was in my house. And there is no way, if I was a person of color, that he would have walked away without seeing what was going on in my house. And I know, it's my responsibility. I need to call them and ask them that. I need to say, you know, I just have to ask you, why didn't you ask to come into my house? What if someone was in my house locked up in the basement somewhere? I didn't ask him though. I didn't even think about it till about 10 minutes after he left. So those are ways we can push ourselves, I think, to challenge the environment around us and to challenge the kind of privileges that we experience as white people on a daily basis and challenge other people's way of thinking.
So that point about I can't believe that happened, one of my personal favorites is, are you sure that was racism? Wow, really? So the way that I think about that is, if we live in a place where that is a question I need to ask, right, along with, you know, the example in the grocery store, right? So is this person reacting in a negative way towards me? Is it about gender? Is it about race? Is it about whatever? If I live in a place where I need to ask these, then done. No other questions need to be asked about, are you sure? Really? No.
Well, and the simple fact that you have to even process
That's
the possibility.
the problem, right.
I mean, you know, the attributional ambiguity, sort of fancy phrase for not knowing what the hell's going on, right? The attributional ambiguity of having to even ask the question when you get crappy customer service or get followed around in the store, and that not being something I have to process. I just have to process, is this person really wanting to make this sale and that's why they're following me and they're just really aggressive, or am I getting bad service because they're a jerk, right? I don't really have to process it the same way. That right there is because even if a given incident isn't about race, the mere fact that you have to spend valuable mental, emotional, physical, psychic energy processing that has literal physiological effects. I mean, the research on health outcomes demonstrates that that experience of having to constantly ask those questions of oneself over and over again just to figure out what is going on can actually take years off your life, that contributes to high blood pressure, that contributes to hypertension, that contributes to some of the release of stress hormones in the blood that we know are related to heart disease. I mean, you know, this is not abstract stuff. This is life and death. And that just the question, even if 99 out of 100 times it wasn't about racism, which is absurd. It's not 99 out of 100. But if it were, just the mere fact that you're still having to ask it is enough to wear one down, right?
Right. Well, and then the thing that underlies the question is the thing that says that there are the racist bad people. It's not that the society is problematic. So when I say to Tim, are you sure that it's racism? The thing that makes that question possible is that we don't expect regular good folk to be behaving in this way. So it must be that he's misreading a situation, because it can't be racism. It must be that he behaved in some way that he wasn't supposed to, and that caused the interaction, right? So it's, again, back to the thing about what is racist and what is racism.
So then, I'm gonna ask the question, is white fear of being called racist actually the biggest problem?
It's a pretty big problem. I don't know that it's not the only problem. It's hard to say it's the biggest one, but it is the big one, because it limits people's ability to talk. And I see it in classrooms all the time. Those of you who've had classes with me, right? So people are afraid to be the first one to say anything because they're afraid they're gonna mess up. And then their racism's gonna stick out, or their racist behavior is gonna stick out. People will be able to tell when it pokes out at the top of their heads. That's how people behave.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
It's like the stuffing in the cushion, like, whoops, your racism showing.
We got up here.
So because this campus is predominantly white, what are some tips and tricks for white folks to get over that fear? Because it's so inherent in our teaching and our experience that being vulnerable in that way comes back to bite us in the ass. So how do we get over that and move to a place of real dialogue without that constant fear being a complete hampering?
I mean, how do you get over the fear of anything, right? You practice it. You keep doing it. I don't know, if any of you are afraid of heights, one of the ways you get over it, if you do, is you sort of experience heights and you realize that, I'm not going to fall to my death, or if you're afraid of snakes or dogs or whatever it is you're afraid of, sometimes the therapy that you might do would be sort of being immersed in that and trying to get over that fear. Now, this is not as deadly as a poisonous snake or, maybe as dangerous as skydiving or something, but it's certainly similar in the sense that if you're afraid of something, the only way you're going to get over that is to work at it and then realize that, my head didn't explode and the world didn't stop spinning on its axis when I brought that up, right? The first time that you do that, the first time that you push back, and it's okay, and life goes on, is the moment that you get a little stronger, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. I don't think there's any other way to get over fear other than confronting it, and perhaps, thinking a little bit about what's scarier. See, to me, dialogue about this is really scary, and changing society is scary because it's hard. What is scarier is not changing society. So if I have a choice about being a little afraid of this thing over here or really petrified about what happens if we don't do this, I'm going to sort of go in this direction because that's a slightly less poisonous snake, right, than the other one.
Mm-hmm. Move out of the place that you feel most comfortable more often. The thing that if you feel like you're in like a warm, fuzzy womb place, it means you're probably not doing this work. Mm-hmm. So move out of there. Now, I'm not saying you have to move all the way. Take baby steps if that's what you need to do. Don't think or understand that your comfort is the most important thing. It really isn't, right? So I said earlier, who were your friends? Who were your lovers? Who were the people that you were most intimate with? Do they all look like you? Do they all believe the same kind of stuff that you do? And if that's the case, step out. Put your little big toe in, and then keep going, right? It's not some kind of, nobody gets the answer, I'm still waiting, right? Nobody gets the answer because there isn't one. It's about making yourself vulnerable even on the day that this is not the thing you want to do.
And can I add to that? I think, too, my biggest fear is that we allow fear of interrogating racism or being called a racist supersede seeing black folks dying. And that's why sometimes our people of color dying. So I think sometimes we have to really take a hard step back and really think about, is emotion superseding life? Mm-hmm. And I want to say right now, sometimes emotion is superseding life in a way, because I can't call in black. I would love to call in black to work sometimes. I wanted to call in black to work when Eric Gardner was a police officer not indicted. I wanted to call in black when I saw Ferguson burning again. You know what I mean? We don't have that luxury, right? Because vulnerability is always there upon a body that is marginalized, right? So let's not, that's my fear. I guess my fear is the fear of superseding life. Mm-hmm. Sorry about that, go ahead.
Thank all three of you for bringing some of these things to the fore. I'll stand up. Okay, I'm standing up. So I have a comment and a question. So my comment is also someone who grew up in the South, Philly. The idea that we can think about race, but not necessarily talk about gender and sexuality and ability and all these other things, right? Even the sheer fact that we're both from the South, but their experience is different. Mm-hmm. First question is, how do you all think about intersectional issues when you're thinking about whiteness in particular? Mm-hmm. And the second part of the question is, my favorite fat black feminist lesbian mother, Audre Lorde, would say, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, right? I'm paraphrasing. What do you see that we can create of new? And what are the first 3 steps you would take to get there?
So I'm going to start with the second part first. Is it okay if I go first?
I want to hear what you say.
Because I've actually thought about that quote a lot. And so this is kind of like my anthropologist brain, which is actually all we have are the master's tools. There's nothing outside of the master's tools. What we need to do is figure out how to use the tools in a way that benefit more people than just the master, right? So if we think about the master's house as the culture that we live in, the tools, that's it. There is no outside. So we need to repurpose the master's tools. We need to figure out how to use how to cause less harm with what's here. What was the other one? Was
Intersectionality.
Intersectional. Well, it's not that that we can't come up with creative new ways to use the tools, but the tools are the tools. You know, I feel as though that sometimes, all right, so go with me on this one for a minute. How many of you used to watch like the old Star Treks? Okay, so those were supposed to be imaginings of humanity, whatever, lots and lots of years in the future. And yet, all the like funky creatures they came up with, we cannot think outside of the sort of race gender paradigm that we have. So all of the creatures they came up with, right, look like weird people. They were sexed, they were raced in a certain kind of way. It is really tough for us, and some anthropologists would argue impossible, to think outside of our cultural paradigm, which is the thing I'm trying to get at about the tools, repurposing, putting, using them in more creative ways. But it's tough to say, now even if we look to other groups, that's a different kind of thing, right? But if we're operating in here, we can learn to repurpose by looking at ways people do it in other places, right? So one of the things that I do with my work is look at whitenesses outside the US. Thinking about how whiteness operates outside the US is a way to sort of reflect the mirror back. That I think of as another tool, right? Or repurposing a tool. So Professor Patterson's other question was about intersectionality. Can't do work on race without that. Impossible. Because we don't just live in bodies that are raced, right? All of us walk around in bodies that are sexed, that are classed, that are all kinds of other things. That I'm not sure how you do race without the other stuff.
Although we've tried for a long time,
Yeah.
and we have done it that way, sadly. I mean, and all of us who've done race work have been guilty of that. We get in our little silos, and we got folks over here doing gender work, and folks over here doing race work, and folks over here doing class work, and other people doing work on sexuality. And so, sadly, we do create this lack of intersectional analysis, and I think that is starting to change, though. I mean, part of what has been so amazing about Black Lives Matter is the way in which, if people really pay close attention to it, there's this presumption that it's just this race-based movement that's about race and it's about blackness and but really, I mean, the activists, the young folks, whether it's in Ferguson, whether it's in Baltimore, wherever it is around the country, have brought a very, very clear feminist consciousness, a very clear consciousness around issues of sexuality and gender identity, are bringing up these issues of the way that not only black male lives, which sometimes are the ones that get the biggest attention in the media because they've been very dramatic and they've been caught on camera, but also women of color and trans women of color in particular who suffer a disproportionate amount of violence both in general and at the hands of law enforcement. So I think we're starting to see this bubble up within the movement. And frankly, it's a really refreshing thing. And some of the old school activists from back in the day aren't real comfortable with it. They don't know how to deal with this young movement, but that's really not young folks' problem. Young folks have got to move forward with this analysis, and I think it's great they're doing it. As far as the master's tool thing and master's house, you know, although I think it's probably a better purpose to just build a new house, right? You're not going to take apart the master's house, but you could build your own house and to hell with the master. So in a way, you create your alternative institutions, you create alternative media when the mainstream media doesn't serve, you create your alternative schools. You know, folks out in Tucson that had their Mexican-American studies program canceled by the state, La Raza Studies program, brilliant program, it was doing great things, and the state came in and said, oh, you can't do this, it's anti-white, it's teaching subversion of the Constitution, all this nonsense. And on the one hand, they're trying to get it back in the schools, which is great, but on the other hand, it's like, wait, y'all also could be teaching that in your homes on the weekend. Don't wait for the school to do that, because I don't trust the school system to teach Mexican-American studies in Tucson or anywhere else. Y'all could do that in your basement. You could do that in your backyard, do that in the church on Saturday. They can't stop you. So create your own alternative ways of doing it. And you know, I was just in Baltimore last week, and I was at Towson State, and this is a really good example, some of the folks at Towson over the last 6-7 years, of a way that some folks from marginalized populations have taken back, not necessarily taken apart the master's house, but have done some really interesting stuff. So this is sort of won't mean a lot to many of you, but if you come out of a competitive debate background at all in high school or college, you know, and I do. That was what I did when I was in school. I was a competitive debater. And historically, competitive debate at the intercollegiate level or at the high school level has been an incredibly white thing. And I mean that not only in terms of the demographic, but in terms of the style of argument and the abstract way in which knowledge is produced and brought forward. It's just, you know, and I was part of that, man. I was implicated as much as anybody. It was just all very abstract. And as a result, a lot of times folks of color and working class folks of all color just don't relate to competitive debate because it's just not real. It's not about the stuff that's going on in their lives. You know, you're talking about these abstract scenarios and it doesn't mean anything. So several years ago, going back now probably almost 20 years, debaters at various programs, University of Louisville was one of the big ones, there were a few others, started introducing very different styles of argumentation, very performative styles of argumentation. So you had like black debaters that would get up and they would speak, but they would also do hip hop in the debate round. They would do spoken word poetry in the debate round, bringing their own wisdom and critical consciousness to the discussion of whatever the topic was. And at first people were like, what is this? What? And then all of a sudden they started questioning the scholars who were being quoted in debate rounds, and they were bringing in organic intellectuals from the community and their wisdom and stuff that maybe wasn't being published in academic journals. And people were like, wait, what are you talking about? So they basically were trying to challenge the whole paradigmatic thinking of how we know what is important knowledge. And pretty soon what ended up happening, both at the high school level and the college level, is these teams would go into debate rounds and they would say, we're not even going to debate the resolution y'all want to debate because this is all bullshit. Like basically they would stand up and they would say, this whole activity reinforces white supremacy. Here's why. They would make their argument as to why and essentially use competitive debate as an activist, as a place for activism. And people lost their mind. Well, here's the deal. The Towson folks have won 3 national championships in the last 7 years, right? And some people not at all happy about that, right? Last 2 years, 2 black women at Towson, they were the first African-American women to ever win a national championship. Several years before that, the 2 African-American men at Towson were the first black males to win a national championship. And they did it by questioning the very basic assumptions of this white male-dominated activity. It was a beautiful thing. Now, that doesn't mean that all of competitive debate has been upturned, but I'll tell you what, if you're a competitive debater in this country now, you better be prepared for that argument. You better know what, African nationalist theories are and Afro-pessimism means, and you better know how to debate these different paradigms that these folks are bringing up. And if you don't know how to do it, you will lose, I promise, right? So that's serious. Like all of a sudden, you've got an activity that looks fundamentally different than it did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's a better place for it because now you've got this ferment. So you might not be able to take apart the house, but you can definitely add some rooms on the house. And you can maybe dig a tunnel under the house and, I don't know, implode it or something. You can do something. Like you can reupholster it. You can put up different wallpaper, and make it look really different and make the master have to deal with the way you want to design the house. And that's what they've done, which I think is pretty incredible.
We got time for one more.
Okay, so I want to first introduce my FYI. We're all sitting together and kind of all across. We're actually Professor Majee's FYI, Dear White People. So we want to thank you guys for coming and talking with us because it's been very cool for us to have this opportunity to come in and listen as well. But I wanted to pose the question that kind of combines a lot of the questions that we've heard here tonight, as well as touches on the sort of do-gooder liberal shutdown of anti-racist discourse. In what ways can we approach the individual to talk about how we can deconstruct this idea of individualism and a racist institution?
In what ways can we deconstruct the idea of individualism and a racist institution, or in relation to a racist institution? Oh my gosh, deconstructing individualism. How much time do we have?
We're out of time, so you gotta make it quick. Give me one liner. Can I take a stab?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm thinking.
What if you thought about it instead of the individual, make people think about this as a collective, right? I think that's really hard for the majority to see themselves as a group. You know, like minority people I've always seen as groups, right? We are not allowed individuality, right? That, period. There's no conceptualization of individuals. And that's both a negative and a positive in terms of grassroots movements coming up, collective action coming up, understanding that we're all in this together. And so I think one way to maybe interrogate this idea of individual is to say, you're not an individual. That's a facade. That's a very Western, heteronormative facade, right? Ain't no individual about you. And before we had this idea of capitalist Western societies, you couldn't survive if you didn't have other people with you to be able to construct a village, to construct a tribe, to take childcare, right? You know, all those things were always collective endeavors. It's only very recently we have put this idea of investment in whiteness that both had talked about, that therefore that means you're an individual. What if you're not, you say, I'm not an individual, I'm actually part of a group. And within that, you're already dismantling one very big piece of what whiteness is.
And you're part of several groups. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, you tell your story. You know, in order for somebody to acknowledge that they're really not just some rugged individual that's just, you know, out there doing their thing, you might need to go first and explain all the different ways in which you're bounded by various identities. You know, if you really want to understand, because you'll hear this all the time, people say, why can't I just be, I'm just Tim, I'm not white, I'm just an American, or I'm just Tim, or I'm just an individual, I want to be viewed as an individual. There is no such thing. Functionally speaking, there's no human being that would be recognizable as such who has not lived a social life. You weren't born on an island, raised by a platypus or whatever the hell lives on an island. Like, every human being in the history of humankind has been social to one extent or another, and you would not want to be around one who hadn't been. If anyone who was truly an individual would be unrecognizable and dangerous as hell, right? Because they would have had inculcated no moral norms, no ethical norms. So we all have these ideas. If you want to really know who Tim is, you have to see me for all of those identities. You have to see, and it matters that I'm white and male and straight and cisgendered and 5'8" in a tall man's world and all this other stuff, you know, like, not bitter about that, by the way. I'm just, you know, it's all good, you know, but I'm just noting, right? You have to know that. You have to know that I'm the child of an alcoholic and an addict, because that shapes who I am as an individual. So the problem is, we think of individual as in its dictionary sense, but we don't lead dictionary lives, we lead encyclopedic lives, right? That is to say, we lead lives that have context and full paragraphs and better descriptions than the, you know, individual, noun, sounds like, you know, whatever that you see in the dictionary, right?
See, part of why they had to go first is that this is such a huge question. Because the idea of the individual then is really tied to all these sort of systems of power that construct the institution. So if we begin to kind of screw with how we think about the individual, right? You know, Nicole said, think about the collective, or begin to critique the idea, because the notion of the individual is what underlies, the whole idea that we can pull ourselves up. We are a nation of individuals who can all pull ourselves up. And if we begin to deconstruct that, then that's a place into thinking about how do we get to an anti-racist institution. It's not, it's a really sort of broad understanding, right, that is paying attention to power. It's paying attention to how it is that certain people get to see themselves as individuals and to feel like they operate that way, while other people never get to do that, right? It's kind of like how it is that we understand the operation of culture. Sorry to go here. How it is we understand that some people have it, right, and others don't. So the individuals don't have culture because they've superseded culture in some way, right? While other people are bound by their culture, and everything they do, they're trapped by their culture and they can't escape, right? So it's a really, yeah, that was a good one. What's your name? Josh. I'm all curious about you now, Josh. Oh, good one.
Well, on that note, so we are at time and overtime. I just want to thank again both Tim Wise and Dr. Anderson-Levy for taking the time out to talk to us tonight. I've got a couple of quick announcements before you go. Everyone check their pockets. If you are short some money, you dropped it and we have it.
Everyone is going to say that's their money.
We don't want to keep it, so if you really drop some money, you have the right amount, we have it. Sina Munger right there. I do want to thank both, off the bat, Black Lives Matter Committee. Can you please stand? Those in the Black Lives Matter Committee. And I also do want to thank those that supported us financially in order to be able to bring Tim here and Lisa here on stage tonight. First, Office of Intercultural Affairs and the Weisberg Program for Human Rights contributed a majority of the money for this program, and then we had a bunch of other contributors across campus, both fraternities, sororities, and clubs. So I do want to acknowledge that. Just a few more before you leave. Check our Facebook out. That's where all our events are at. And so I'm going to plug that as a way to have you guys engage with what we're going to do. This is kind of the beginning of another year-long initiative that we've been pushing. The next biggest thing that's going to be happening in terms of Black Lives Matter Beloit is actually going on right now is the Insider-Outsider play produced by Amy Sarno in conjunction with her students. They're going to be in the Kresge Theater, thank you. They're playing yesterday and tomorrow, and then next Thursday, Friday, Saturday. After each play, there'll be a talk back that members of our committee will be at in order to engage about what it means to be an insider or outsider here. And all the stories that are part of that play are based upon real life things that have happened on campus. Following that, on October 23rd, which is a Friday in the Bungee Theater, is another play that produced by one of our own, Rebecca Evans, who's a student and also a Beloit community member, along with John Kaufman, professor of theater, that's called Race Replays. It's an interactive stage play in which the audience they're going to actually act things out, and the audience participates and engages with the conversation. Following that, the next big panel we're doing is November 13th. That's going to be here as of right now. We're going to actually have a panel about how does the community deal with diversity. We're going to have members of the Beloit community, the Beloit College community on stage, really talking with Dr. Ron Nakor about what does it mean to be a diverse community and what does it mean to operate within that when we have what's going on, Black Lives Matter. But before that, the YWCA is having a racial justice conference on the 12th of November. Mr. McDaniels will be one of the keynote speakers there. It is going to be at the Holiday Inn Express in Janesville. There'll be flyers circulating, and if you want more information, please let one of us know. We've got flyers that are going to be going out. We'll also do an email blast in conjunction with that. That's all I have. So I want to thank you all. Tim will be doing a book signing. I'm sorry. Right now, Tim will be doing a book signing on stage as soon as we're off, so please stick around for that for the next half hour or so. Have a good night, everybody.